She was always in control, the press briefings, the headlines, the power plays. But that night on a frozen back road in New Hampshire, all her control vanished, and someone unexpected stepped in to save her. The sky was a bruised gray, thick clouds hanging low as snow spiraled down like feathers from a torn sky. Caroline Leavitt gripped the steering wheel of her black Escalade, her breath fogging the windshield despite the heater blasting on full. The GPS had long lost its signal, and the road signs had disappeared under a thick blanket of white. She wasn't supposed to be here, not on a narrow back road in the middle of rural New Hampshire the night before Christmas. But a private fundraiser for a key donor had run late, and against her assistant's advice, she decided to drive herself back to Concord. "I've handled foreign policy crises, for God's sake," she muttered, squinting at the snow-covered road. "I can handle a little weather." But the storm had different plans. Her tires skidded slightly on a curve. She eased off the gas. A second later, the rear wheels lost traction completely. The vehicle swerved. Her heart lurched. In one chaotic blur, the SUV slid off the shoulder and into a shallow ditch, the nose of the car sinking into a drift. She slammed the brake. Too late. Silence followed, just the sound of wind howling outside. And then, the harsh realization. She was stuck. Caroline tried reversing. The tires spun uselessly. She checked her phone. No service. She stared at the signal bar like she could will it back. She was a White House press secretary, a political shark, and now a stranded woman alone in a snowstorm. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. And then came a knock on the window. Out of the blinding snow, a stranger appeared, and in that moment, the woman who always had the answers found herself completely at his mercy. Startled, Caroline turned. A man stood outside, bundled in layers of mismatched coats, his beard frosted, a wool hat pulled low over his brow. He looked like he'd been walking for miles. In the snow behind him, an old wooden sled carrying chopped firewood. She cracked the window slightly. Cold air rushed in like a slap. "You all right, ma'am?" His voice was calm, deep, weathered. "I skidded," she replied, her tone guarded. "No service, no idea where I am." "You're about 5 miles outside Jackson," he said, eyeing the car. "You won't get it out tonight, and it's dropping below 10 soon." He looked at her for a moment, then said, "I've got a cabin up the ridge, not far. You'll freeze here." Caroline hesitated. She didn't take chances with strangers, but her body was already trembling and her toes numb inside her boots. She nodded slowly. He helped her out of the vehicle, steadying her on the slick road. No introductions, just action. He moved with quiet strength, leading the way up a snow-laced path that twisted between bare trees and silent shadows. The cabin came into view, small, worn, smoke curling from a crooked chimney. Inside it was Spartan but warm. A fire glowed in the hearth. Cans and boxes lined open shelves. A cot, a table, a battered armchair. "Sit by the fire," he said simply, hanging up his soaked coat. "I'll get tea going." She looked around, unsure of what she'd walked into, but her hands were too numb to care. The fire warmed her face, the scent of pine logs curling in the air. He returned with 2 chipped mugs. "Name's Thomas," he said at last. "Don't worry, you're safe here." She sipped the tea, strong, earthy. It hit her stomach like a spark. She studied him in the flickering light. His face was lined, his eyes quiet. He didn't ask who she was, didn't recognize her, or didn't care. For the first time in years, Caroline Leavitt felt anonymous, and oddly, it was a relief. She expected a recluse, but instead she found a soldier, and every word he spoke painted a world she'd never seen from her polished podium. The morning light crept in slow through the frosted window, casting soft orange on the cabin walls. Caroline stirred on the cot, startled to realize she'd actually slept. The smell of something warm drifted through the air. Eggs, maybe. Coffee? She sat up and saw Thomas by the small propane stove, flipping something in a cast-iron pan. The fire had been stoked again. The room was alive with warmth. "Figured you'd need something hearty," he said without turning. She blinked. "You cook too?" He chuckled. "Learn to survive. Cooking's part of that." They sat at the small table, eating in silence. Then between bites he said, "You don't strike me as the type who breaks down on back roads." She raised an eyebrow. "You don't strike me as someone who lives in the woods." He smiled faintly. "Touché." Then he opened up. He'd served 3 tours: Afghanistan, Iraq, places that change the way a man walks, talks, breathes. He spoke of sandstorms and broken radios, of losing friends and coming home to a country that had moved on. "I came back, but the world I left didn't return with me," he said, looking into the fire. He told her how the VA line stretched for miles, how he applied for jobs, over and over. But employers didn't want the baggage, how he drank for a while, how it nearly killed him. "Now," he shrugged, "I live out here. It's quiet. I chop wood. Help out when I can. Some of us don't fit into the city anymore." Caroline listened, stunned. She thought about the briefings she gave, the sound bites, the promises. She had crafted words for policy leaders who had never sat across a table from someone like Thomas. She stirred her coffee. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For not knowing," she replied. "For never asking." For the first time since she arrived, his expression softened. "You're here now," he said simply. "That's something." Her phone came back to life, but the voice on the other end reminded her of the life she was expected to return to and the person she was starting to leave behind. Around noon, her phone buzzed to life, barely a flicker of signal, but enough to ping. 23 missed calls, 8 texts, a frantic voicemail from her assistant, Amanda. "Caroline, are you okay? You missed the morning call with the president's team. Nobody's heard from you. Please, just text back. Anything." She stepped outside the cabin, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The air was still sharp, the woods hushed. She called Amanda. The line crackled, but connected. "I'm fine," she said. "Skidded off the road. I'm with someone." "He helped me." Amanda exhaled. "Thank God." "The media's starting to ask questions. Do you need a chopper? We can send local PD." "No," Caroline said firmly. "I'll drive out once the snow clears. I just need a little time." There was a pause on the other end. "Okay, but your afternoon's packed. Zoom with Fox and the briefings." "Cancel it," she cut in. "Reschedule everything." When she hung up, she looked out over the trees. Inside that small cabin, Caroline Leavitt, America's no-nonsense mouthpiece, felt something unravel, something deeper than the snow melting on her coat. For the first time in years, she didn't want to go back. She wasn't supposed to see it, but when she did, her heart broke. Caroline had stayed the night again. She told herself it was because the roads were still too icy, but deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't ready to leave. Thomas had gone outside to split firewood. She offered to help, but he shook his head with a half-smile. You stay warm, city folks bruise easy. She wandered the cabin, eyes falling on a small box under the cot. It wasn't hidden, exactly, just tucked away like something set aside long ago. She hesitated. Then curiosity won. Inside was a worn leather journal, pages filled with slanted handwriting and faded ink. She opened to the middle. Sketches of soldiers, of sunsets, of a little girl with wild curls and a missing front tooth. Then letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to Maya. Caroline's eyes moved across the words, "I miss your laugh, baby girl, the way you used to call me Daddy Tough. I hope your mom reads these to you, even if she never writes back. I hope you know I never stopped loving you." She swallowed hard. Thomas walked in a moment later, arms full of logs. He froze when he saw what she was holding. "You went through my things." Her face flushed. I didn't mean to pry. He set the wood down slowly. "It's all right. It ain't a secret. Just hurts to remember." He sat down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Maya's my daughter. Haven't seen her since she was 4. Her mom moved on. I wasn't stable. Couldn't blame her." Caroline listened, heart heavy. "I write to her anyway. Still do. Maybe one day she'll find them." She placed the journal gently back in the box. "I think she'd be proud of you," she said quietly. Thomas didn't answer, but his eyes glistened in the firelight. She left the cabin, but something inside her stayed behind. By morning, the storm had cleared. Sunlight bounced off the snow like diamonds scattered across the world. Caroline stood beside the SUV, now unstuck thanks to Thomas's shovel and quiet determination. "You sure you'll be okay out here?" she asked. He nodded. "Storms don't bother me." She opened the door, hesitating. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." He offered a crooked smile. "You're welcome. Don't forget to turn on traction control next time." She laughed, but it faded fast. "I want to repay you. There has to be something I can do." He shook his head. "Helping people shouldn't come with a receipt. You needed help. That was enough." Caroline didn't have words for that, so she just nodded and drove. Back in D.C., the noise swallowed her. The horns, the headlines, the lights. Her office was just as she left it, cold, organized, ruthless. But her mind was elsewhere. On a cabin in the woods. On a girl named Maya. On a man who chopped wood for strangers and wrote letters he never mailed. She sat at her desk and stared at the blinking cursor on her screen. And for the first time in her career, she didn't care what it said. She stood before the cameras. But this time, the script wasn't polished. It was personal. The press room buzzed with its usual static. Lights, microphones, eager eyes ready to dissect every syllable. Caroline stepped to the podium. Her suit was immaculate, her hair perfectly pinned. But her voice, it had changed. She looked over the sea of reporters, then folded her notes. "I had a prepared statement," she began, "but I'd rather speak plainly today." Cameras clicked. Pens paused. "Last week I was stranded in a blizzard. A man I'd never met took me in. No questions, no expectations." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes searched the room. "He's a veteran, a father, a man forgotten by the system. The kind of American we all claim to care about, but rarely see." She let the silence hang. "We need to do better, not just in policy, in presence, in action." The room was dead quiet. No spin, no slogan, just truth. And for once, that was enough. He disappeared into the snow, but she wasn't letting him vanish from her life again. The next weekend, Caroline returned to New Hampshire. She followed the same road, the same path, but the cabin was empty. No smoke, no fire, just footprints, half buried in snow, leading away. She asked locals. A shopkeeper remembered a quiet man who came in for canned beans and nails. Doesn't talk much, but polite. Might be living near the old railway line. She spent 2 days searching. Nothing. Back in D.C., she tried another route. She found his last known Army contact, then cross-referenced emergency shelter records. Nothing recent. Then she found a lead, an old VA form with a name. Maya Jensen, listed once as next of kin. It took more digging, more calls. until finally she had an address, Portland, Maine, and a sliver of hope. She wrote the letter herself, not as a press secretary, as a woman who owed a stranger her life, and maybe, just maybe, a father his daughter. She gave him a second chance, but what he did next surprised even her. Maya Jensen opened the door slowly, a baby on her hip and cautious eyes fixed on the stranger in a gray coat. Caroline smiled gently. "You don't know me, but I met someone who loves you very much." Maya's guard stayed up. "Who?" "Thomas, your father." Her expression flickered. Shock, disbelief, a hint of pain. "I thought he was gone." "He's alive. He saved my life, and he still writes to you every single day." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes. She stepped back, cradling the child. "Why are you here?" "To bring you back to him, if you're willing." 2 days later, Caroline stood at the edge of a snowy clearing in New Hampshire. She'd found Thomas again, camped near an abandoned train depot, fire crackling under the stars. He turned at the sound of footsteps and froze. Maya stepped forward slowly, holding her daughter. "Hi, Dad!" His hands trembled. For a moment he couldn't move. Then he rushed to her, pulling them both into a quiet, tearful embrace. No words were needed. Caroline watched from a distance, breath caught in her throat. She came to repay a debt. But she had given him something more. Family. Unit 2, it started with a flat tire. It ended with a home for dozens of forgotten heroes. Weeks passed. Back in Washington, Caroline didn't let the momentum fade. She tapped into her donor network, not for campaign money, but for something else entirely. "We need a place for people like Thomas," she told them. "Somewhere they can heal, somewhere they belong." And they answered. The Honor House broke ground 6 months later, a refurbished brick building in a quiet corner of New Hampshire. It had 10 beds, a full kitchen, therapy rooms, and a workshop. The front porch bore a single plaque, "For those who gave everything and asked nothing." Thomas was there on opening day, now working as the shelter's caretaker. Maya and her daughter had moved nearby. The old soldier had found peace, not in silence, but in service. He gave tours, taught woodshop, sat quietly with men who couldn't speak about their past until they saw it reflected in his eyes. And when a news crew showed up, Caroline stayed out of the spotlight. "This isn't about me," she told the reporters. "It never was." He fixed her car. She fixed his life. But in the end, they both healed something deeper. Back in D.C., Caroline sat with her husband and son, dinner warm on the table. She looked out the window, snow falling in gentle silence. Her phone buzzed. A photo came through. Thomas, standing under the Honor House sign, surrounded by veterans and neighbors. Maya beside him, smiling. Caroline smiled too, tears pricking her eyes. She had fought 100 political battles, made headlines, shaped narratives. But this was the only legacy that mattered. She picked up her son and whispered, "One day I'll tell you about a man named Thomas, and how he reminded me what it means to be human." Then she turned off the phone, leaned into the warmth of her family, and let the snow fall. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of what kindness can do, and leave a comment below. What would you do if you had the power to change just one life? Because sometimes all it takes is one act of compassion to rewrite someone's story and your own.